Nearly 3,000 Parrott rifles of all types were produced for the U.S. Army and U.S. Navy during the American Civil War, making it one of the most common and arguably most successful systems of artillery in the war. However, if you asked people today, you might be told that the Parrott rifle was more dangerous to the crews manning it than the enemy it was being fired upon. Yet the Parrott rifle was instrumental in the capture of Fort Pulaski in Georgia in 1862, as well as the capture of Fort Macon in North Carolina also in 1862. And it was the Parrott rifle, batteries of Parrott rifles, that battered and all but destroyed Fort Sumter in 1863 and 1864. Visitors to Fort Sumter today can still find 100-pounder Parrott shot embedded in the walls of the fort. The Parrott rifle contributed meaningfully to ultimate United States victory during the American Civil War. It was manufactured in a variety of sizes, from the 2.9-inch or 10-pounder Parrott rifle used as a field gun, to the massive 10-inch or 300-pounder Parrott rifle intended for use in the most important seacoast fortifications. The Parrott rifle was used in every theater of the war. It was used on land. It was used on the waters. The Parrott rifle is named after its inventor, Robert Parker Parrott. Parrott was the superintendent of the West Point Foundry in Cold Spring, New York. Such was the importance of his guns that someone suggested during the war a new candidate for the national bird. Artillery developed very slowly over the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. Guns tapered very slightly from breech to muzzle. Reinforces were cast into the barrel. Those are the very small rings, but they're just part of the casting. They did very little to increase the strength of the guns. By the 1840s, the pace of technological change increased rapidly. Guns were designed to fire explosive shells which could be devastating both to wooden ships and troops ashore. The research of people like Colonel Bomford in the United States showed that the pressure inside a gun was greatest at the breech and dropped off rapidly. Such research was used by Navy officer John Dahlgren to develop his soda bottle-shaped Dahlgren gun, and as I covered in a previous video, it was also used by U.S. Army officer Thomas Rodman to produce his family of Rodman guns. In the 1850s, Daniel Treadwell of Massachusetts developed a system of heat-shrinking wrought iron bands onto a cast-iron gun to increase its strength. Treadwell's guns were strong, but they were frankly hideously expensive for their size and also too light for the amount of charge they could withstand. The 1850s also saw incredible improvements in rifled musketry, including the development and fielding of expanding base conical bullets that could be loaded quickly and effectively by troops. Artillery manufacturers began to explore using some of these developments in their larger guns. In the United Kingdom, inventors such as George Armstrong and Theophilus Blakely and Joseph Whitworth began combining these different elements: a rifled barrel, built-up construction, cast iron, wrought iron, and steel in some cases, breech loading, to create an entirely new generation of artillery. At the outbreak of the American Civil War, there were almost no rifled guns in the Americas. Both Union and Confederates alike bought up as many as they could, including guns manufactured by the West Point Foundry in Cold Spring, New York. West Point Foundry built some of the first locomotives in the United States, including the Best Friend of Charleston, which began service in South Carolina in 1830. In 1836, Robert Parker Parrott was appointed superintendent of West Point Foundry. West Point Foundry produced ordnance for both the U.S. Army and U.S. Navy, ranging from the tiny flank howitzers of the U.S. Army all the way to the giant 11-inch Dahlgrens of the U.S. Navy. In 1861, Parrott submitted a patent for a rifled cannon of his own design. It featured a cast iron barrel that was reinforced at the breech with a wrought iron band. Parrott was not the first person to suggest such a basic design, but his method of construction was unique. He wrote that the wrought iron reinforce may be made in various ways, but that which I consider the best is to take a bar of square iron of proper dimensions, coil it spirally upon a mandrel, then heat it to a welding heat and place it in a strong cast iron cylinder and hammer it endwise until the coils are welded together and a sound hollow wrought iron cylinder is formed. The cylinder thus forged is to be bored and turned in the lathe to the proper size and thickness. The cast iron barrel was then turned on a lathe until the diameter of its breech was 1/16 of an inch greater than the inside diameter of the wrought iron reinforce. The wrought iron reinforce was heated until it glowed red in the dark, and then it was placed over the breech. Meanwhile, the cast iron tube was rotated on bearings, and water was pumped through the barrel to avoid the cast iron from expanding as well, and to encourage the wrought iron band to cool from its inside out. Parrott believed that rotating the tube prevented the band from sticking unevenly to the surface. Parrott projectiles were designed with a base of soft metal that would expand by the action of the explosion of the propellant charge. Expanding it would engage the rifling, which would allow the rifling to impart spin to the conical projectile. The smallest Parrott was the U.S. Army 10-pounder. As the name implies, it fired an approximately 10-pound projectile. It had a 2.9-inch bore and weighed about 900 pounds. The original 10-pounders had a slight muzzle swell, and they tapered toward the breech and had the distinctive barrel band. In 1863, to standardize with other types, the 10-pounder received a 3-inch bore, and that is marked on the breech. The 10-pounder Parrott rifle was an effective field artillery piece. It was light, accurate, durable. It was kept in service throughout the Civil War and in limited capacity afterwards. It's only in comparison to the U.S. Army 3-inch ordnance rifle that it's seen as somehow flawed. The ordnance rifle was exceptionally durable. It was about 90 pounds lighter. The thing was, the ordnance rifle cost twice as much per gun to produce than the Parrott. When you have to equip an army, things like that matter. More ordnance rifles were produced than 10-pounder Parrotts, but the 10-pounder Parrott had its place in the U.S. Army. The next size up was the 20-pounder. The 20-pounder had a 3.67-inch bore. It weighed about 1,700 pounds. As the name suggests, it fired an approximately 20-pound projectile. Most period sources referred to these guns by their pounder designation. They were much like smoothbore artillery, also referred to in that way. A 6-pounder smoothbore had a 3.67-inch barrel, but no one referred to it as a 3.67-inch smoothbore. The 20-pounder Parrott was in an awkward intermediate position. It was too heavy for effective use as a field piece. It was hard to drag around the field, but it was not heavy enough for effective use as a siege artillery piece. Indeed, it was actually less mobile than some purpose-designed siege artillery pieces that, when limbered, were on 4 wheels. It was a better fit for the Navy, and indeed was a great fit for merchant ships taken into naval service, or in this case, an Army transport. It was carried by purpose-built Navy ships, places like on the forecastle of a ship, or again on merchant steamers. Almost anything that could float and put to sea could mount a 20-pounder Parrott. It gave such ships a piece with long range and effective firepower against other lightly built ships, like blockade runners. As can be seen here, the naval version differs from the Army version principally by having a ring at the cascable for a breeching rope. The U.S. Army 30-pounder Parrott rifle has a 4.2-inch bore, weighs 4,200 pounds, and is 10.5 feet long. At 25 degrees elevation, it can reach 6,700 yards. It's a massive gun. It's a siege artillery piece, although one of its first actions was with the U.S. Army at the Battle of First Manassas, where it provided devastating fire on Confederate positions. But its size and relative lack of mobility surely contributed to the gun being captured. Number 29 here at Vicksburg shows what the gun looks like up close. Note the 1861 manufacture date on this example. The 30-pounder proved very successful against masonry fortifications. At the siege of Fort Pulaski, 30-pounders, along with a small number of quite a bit heavier converted smoothbores, rifled smoothbores, were able to hit the fort over and over again. While smoothbores struggled to hit the fort at all, the rifles hit the same point in the brick wall, eventually threatening the magazines and forcing the surrender of the fort. At the siege of Fort Macon in North Carolina, the story was much the same. Parrott rifles were used to threaten the magazines, which forced the surrender of the Confederates in the fort. The U.S. Army used 30-pounders on the north end of what's now called Folly Beach to support the landing of U.S. troops on Morris Island. Furthermore, 30-pounders were used against Fort Wagner and Battery Gregg to support U.S. Army operations, including the attack of the 54th Massachusetts on Fort Wagner. The use of 30-pounders on Morris Island continued, including in the bombardment of the city of Charleston from Morris Island. One 30-pounder fired 4,600 rounds at Charleston before finally bursting. The 30-pounder was also used to equip U.S. Army fortifications, as shown in this picture of Fort Stevens, one of the fortifications around Washington, D.C. After the Civil War, the 30-pounder was a relatively common gun to be donated to local communities. It survives in fairly large numbers. The U.S. Navy version of the 30-pounder could be found on almost all types of ships in the fleet, from this one on the ironclad USS Cairo to this one carried by USS Hartford to converted merchant steamers. It was an effective long-range piece that was 2 feet shorter than the Army version and about 700 pounds lighter. It saw widespread service in the U.S. Navy during the war. The 60-pounder was only purchased by the Navy and then only in 1864 and 1865. It shared the same 5.3-inch bore as the old 18-pounder smoothbore. It weighed 5,400 pounds. Post-war, it was frequently mounted on the forecastle of U.S. Navy sloops and other steamers, where it was a chase gun. The U.S. Army 100-pounder Parrott rifle had a 6.4-inch bore. It weighed just under 10,000 pounds. Designed for use in seacoast fortifications, it was used to arm the fortifications around Washington, D.C., as shown in the previous photo. It was used in the siege of Yorktown in 1862. It was extensively used in the bombardments against Fort Sumter from Morris Island, which fired thousands of rounds from 100-pounder Parrott rifles. The 100-pounder Parrott had a long range of over 8,000 yards. It was an accurate, effective, powerful, if unreliable, gun. It continued in U.S. Army service after the Civil War. This battery of 11 100-pounders was mounted at Fort Sumter in the 1870s. It is also a relatively common type to have been donated to local communities from about 1890 to 1910. The Army model has a place for a Navy breeching rope. Indeed, it's the same gun. It differs only in its markings. Army markings are typically on the muzzle of a Parrott rifle. Navy markings are on top of the breech band. In naval service, the 100-pounder could be found mounted as a pivot gun, as it was on the Sassacus-class gunboats like USS Mendota, which was well photographed. You can see the 100-pounders at either end with the pivot rails open. Here again is one of Mendota's pivot guns, and here is one of Mendota's pivot guns, videoed just a few weeks ago in Hartford City, Indiana. When I visited, someone had placed a small United States flag, the little pole, directly in the mounting point for the rear sight. The rear sight was an adjustable sight, and the forward sight was a blade mounted on another little point just above the right trunnion. This sort of monument is typical of the way that Parrott rifles and other guns are displayed in cemeteries. This is another photo taken aboard Mendota of one of its 100-pounder Parrotts, maybe the gun I just photographed in Indiana. But as we zoom in, we can see the adjustable rear sight and the forward blade sight. You can also see the elevating screw and how it connects to the cascable. The 100-pounder was also frequently used in broadside mountings, like in this famous photograph of a ship's boy aboard USS New Hampshire. The broadside mounting had a forward wheel and a rear skid, but was otherwise a traditional naval carriage. The 100-pounder Parrott frequently served alongside the U.S. Navy 9-inch Dahlgren, a smoothbore. The rifle had longer range, was great for bombarding shore targets at a distance. The 9-inch smoothbore was effective against wooden ships, also against exposed personnel, as it was a more effective means of firing grape shot or canister. This second photo of the same U.S. Navy gunboat shows the crews of both the 100-pounder aimed over the bow and the 9-inch Dahlgren aimed to starboard. Though infamously 5 U.S. Navy 100-pounders burst during the First Battle of Fort Fisher, causing more casualties in the fleet than all of the Confederate return fire did, and I believe causing more casualties in the fleet than the entire bombardment caused among the Confederates. The U.S. Navy actually kept the 100-pounder in service after the war. It served well into the 1870s aboard U.S. Navy ships. Though most U.S. Navy Parrotts were cast solid and then bored out, a few of the final ones produced were cast with a water tube in the barrel as the casting cooled. These are marked water core on the muzzle face. The U.S. Army 200-pounder Parrott rifle had an 8-inch bore. It weighed more than 16,000 pounds, and despite the designation, usually fired a 150-pound projectile with a 16-pound propellant charge. It was designed for seacoast defense, although it was used extensively in the bombardment of Fort Sumter. You can actually see one at Fort Sumter. This one was one of 3 brought to the fort in the 1870s, and at least 2 were brought to Fort Moultrie just across Charleston Harbor. The most famous 200-pounder Parrott rifle is by far U.S. Army 200-pounder Parrott Number 6, the Swamp Angel, which was used to bombard Charleston at a range of over 7,000 yards from a specially constructed battery in the marsh. On its 36th round, the breech blew out the back of the barrel band. Number 6 was saved from the scrap heap after the war. It's missing its barrel band, but the breech has been reattached, and it is on display in Trenton, New Jersey. The bombardment of Charleston, which began with the fires of the Swamp Angel, continues to elicit strong feelings. But from a technical standpoint, hitting a target by firing using compass bearings at night at a range of, again, over 7,000 yards was a notable technical achievement, even if the target in question was an area target like a city. That sort of thing had not been possible before the development of rifled ordnance like the Parrott. I'll eventually make a video on the bombardments of Charleston. The U.S. Navy called the 8-inch Parrott rifle a 150-pounder, which was again more in line with the actual projectiles used. It could be mounted as a heavy pivot gun, shown here on the forecastle of USS Wabash. It might also be found as the primary armament, the single heavy gun carried upon a smaller gunboat like is shown here on USS Nipsic. It was also mounted as one of the 2 guns in the turrets of several of the Passaic-class ironclads, which carried a 15-inch Dahlgren and a smaller gun. On most of them it was an 11-inch Dahlgren, but the 150-pounder Parrott rifle weighed about the same as the 11-inch and had a longer range. After her 1863 refit, USS Niagara actually carried 12 150-pounders on her spar deck. The 150-pounder was also used by U.S. Navy sailors to to equip a breaching battery against Fort Sumter on Morris Island, and it was mounted as the fore and aft pivot guns on USS Atlanta, the former Confederate ironclad CSS Atlanta. After the war, all of the 150-pounders were removed from service, and by the 1880s they had all been scrapped, or nearly all of them had been scrapped. Thus, the 150-pounders on Atlanta might be the only ones still in existence, as Atlanta sunk after the war on a delivery voyage to Haiti, where she'd been purchased for the Haitian Navy. Maybe those 150-pounders exist somewhere off the North Carolina coast. I'm not sure we'll ever know. While devastating against masonry targets, the Parrott rifle proved to be not terribly effective against iron armored targets. This September 1864 U.S. Navy test shows the results of various naval guns being fired at a 5-inch iron plate. The 8-inch Parrott, using a 146-pound steel shot, left a sizable dent in the plate, but a similar weight gun, the 10-inch Dahlgren, a new model of Dahlgren developed during the war, which could stand a 40-pound propellant charge, more than twice what the 8-inch Parrott could stand, punched clean through the plate. Even the 11-inch Dahlgren, with its upgraded 30-pound propellant charge, left a more noticeable impact. In fact, the only gun that the 8-inch Parrott did better than was the 7-inch Confederate Brooke rifle. The heaviest gun in the Parrott system was the U.S. Army 300-pounder Parrott rifle. It had a 10-inch bore and weighed nearly 27,000 pounds. It too was designed for seacoast defense, although it was employed in combat during the war to bombard Fort Sumter. One of them is displayed at Fort Moultrie, very near Fort Sumter. The 10-inch Parrott was also mounted in seacoast fortifications like Fort Jefferson, where 4 of them still exist. As I said, it was used against Fort Sumter. One of them suffered a burst shell at the muzzle, but continued being fired. The 10-inch Parrott typically fired a 250-pound projectile. The Navy seems to have designated it a 250-pounder, but never purchased any for service. As I said near the beginning, Parrotts might be best known today for bursting in action. Indeed, Mike Ryan, in his excellent paper on the historic guns of Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie, lists all the Parrott rifles that burst in action during the American Civil War. It is a long list. It turns out that some 60 100-pounder Parrotts burst, as well as 22 8-inch Parrotts. If you look through Gilmore's book on the operations against Charleston, you can see all sorts of drawings of burst Parrotts. I think it's necessary to remember a couple things. One, the Parrott dates from 1861. It's an early 1860s design. Also, rifled guns were hard. John Dahlgren's attempt to produce cast-iron rifled guns was really not all that successful. Whereas smoothbores by their design had some windage, some space between the projectile and the bore for a gas to escape during firing, rifles did not. Their base expanded to engage the rifling, and any flaw ended up in an unfortunate incident, like this Sawyer rifle bombarding Mobile in 1864. Even the British-made Whitworths on Morris Island suffered. In 1865, the Bureau of Ordnance put together a report on these Parrott burstings. That board came up with the primary problem being shells that detonated within the barrel sometimes, and they recommended that a waxy liner be put inside the shell to help prevent these inside the barrel explosions from happening. Parrott thought that the sandy conditions on Morris Island contributed to the bursting, and if you look again at this photo of the 100-pounder battery firing on Fort Sumter, note that the shells are stacked in sand. I grew up on the Carolina coast. If you're at the beach, sand gets everywhere. It's hard to imagine that with the tight tolerances of Parrotts, with sand getting in the bore, that didn't contribute at least a little bit. No matter how careful the gunners were, sand was going to get everywhere. I think there's probably another factor. The Parrott, to me, seems like a gun built without a lot of extra overhead. John Dahlgren's smoothbores, it turned out you could double the powder charge and the things would still work. That wasn't the case with Parrotts. I don't think there was a lot of room for excess pressure. Colonel James Benton, writing after the war, attributed the bursting to the shells not being structurally strong enough. He wrote that research had showed that sometimes the base collapsed in on itself upon firing, and that contributed to the bursting. I think the Parrott was a fine gun. It might not have been the best rifled gun, but it was the best rifled gun available in numbers to the U.S. Army and U.S. Navy in the early 1860s. It destroyed forts. It helped capture forts. No other system of heavy rifled artillery was asked to fire hundreds, if not thousands, of rounds per barrel in the early 1860s in combat conditions. Only the Confederate Brooke rifle had similar demands placed upon it, and only in just a couple instances. The ones that come to mind are two 7-inch Brookes that were mounted on the barbette of Fort Sumter in the summer of 1863 that provided counter-battery fire against Federal batteries on Morris Island, and both of those Brookes eventually cracked or burst. With apologies to the chieftain, I would argue that the Parrott rifle is the Civil War equivalent of the Sherman tank. Plenty of stories have been told about how it was more dangerous to its own crews than the enemy. Especially on land, that wasn't the case. What it was a mass-producible system of artillery which delivered more ordnance on target than any other system, which performed better than most other contemporary systems. Remember, it's the early 1860s we're talking about here. It was a war-winning system, and it helped win the war. Parrott rifles continued to serve the U.S. Army and U.S. Navy into the 1870s. In the 1870s, there was a desire to modernize the guns, and the U.S. Navy converted a number into breechloaders. The original breech was sliced off, the bore was bored out at the breech, and a steel sleeve inserted and an interrupted screw breech attached. 100-pounders were converted into 80-pounders. A small number served, including this one on USS Pensacola. 4 30-pounders were specifically converted for the side-wheeler USS Michigan on the Great Lakes. A small number of 20-pounders were converted, mostly for training and saluting purposes. But by far the most common conversion was the 60-pounder, which became the standard forecastle armament for U.S. Navy sloops and gunboats during the 1870s, 1880s, into the 1890s. 2 survive on original carriages at Laconia, New Hampshire. There's another one at Oyster Bay, New York. But throughout the late 1870s, 1880s, almost every commissioned U.S. Navy warship carried one of these 60-pounder breechloaders. How reliable were they? Well, records show a couple failed, but none seem to have catastrophically burst. The final one was carried through 1898 by USS Mohican as she deployed to the Hawaiian Islands during the Spanish-American War to guard that area. That seems to be the last deployment of a U.S. Navy Parrott rifle on a cruising warship, certainly during wartime. The era of the Parrott rifle had ended. Friends, thank you for watching. If you're interested in Civil War artillery, I have a website where I try to tell stories of U.S. Navy sailors, Marines, U.S. Army soldiers and sailors of the Civil War in general, through looking at preserved artillery. I also tell stories of ships, and I'm doing this series on Civil War artillery. I previously did a video on Rodman guns. Upcoming videos will cover Brooke rifles, Dahlgren guns, and others. Follow me for more. Visit Santee1821.net. Thank you so much.